Good afternoon and welcome to the Washington Report with Tea Party Patriots Action. I'm Bill Pasco, Tea Party Patriots man in Washington. Let's get to it. The House and Senate will return Monday and stay in session through Thursday. Then the House will be out until August 31. The Senate will be in for another 2 weeks. Last week in the House came back on Monday and voted to pass 2 bills under suspension of the rules. On Tuesday, the House passed a rule governing floor consideration of several bills. Then the House took up and passed H.R. 139, the Sunshine Protection Act, which makes daylight savings time permanent, so we won't go through the twice-a-year resetting of our clocks. Then the House took up and passed H.R. 1181, the Protecting Privacy in Purchases Act. On Wednesday, the House took up H.R. 8595, the National Security State Department Appropriations Bill for fiscal year 2027. At 4:43 p.m., according to the official vote tally, a majority of House Democrats did something they'd never done before. They voted to cut off military aid to Israel. The amendment to the spending bill was offered by Republican Thomas Massie of Kentucky, and he was the only Republican who voted for it. That wasn't a surprise. What was a surprise was that 103 Democrats, a majority of the House Democratic caucus, joined him in voting for it. 98 Democrats voted against it, and 10 voted present. The Democrat leadership was split. Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries voted against it, while Minority Whip Kathleen Clark of Massachusetts voted for it. This is being described as a seismic shift in Democratic Party thinking. It happened that when the State of Israel declared its existence and its independence as a sovereign nation in 1948, a Democrat by the name of Harry Truman was president, and he waited all of 11 minutes after Israel's declaration to officially recognize the State of Israel. Democratic support for Israel has been a thing ever since, but maybe not so much anymore. We'll keep our eye on that going forward. The House continued voting on amendments to the National Security State Department Appropriations Bill, all of which failed. Then the House took up and passed H.R. 8595, the National Security State Department Appropriations Bill, by a vote of 217 to 209, with just one Republican, Thomas Massie of Kentucky, and one Democrat, Jared Golden of Maine, crossing party lines to vote with the other side. And then they were done. This week in the House will return today with the first vote set for 6:30 p.m., at which time the House is scheduled to consider 24 bills under suspension of the rules. On Tuesday, and for the balance of the week, the House is scheduled to consider 6 bills pursuant to a rule. They are H.R. 6955, the Main Street Capital Access Act, H.R. 7008, the Stop Insider Trading Act, H.R. 8800, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2027, H-Con Res, we're still waiting for a number, establishing the congressional budget for the United States government for fiscal year 2027, and setting forth the appropriate budgetary levels for fiscal years 2028 through 2036. That's the Budget Reconciliation Bill. The Budget Reconciliation Resolution. H.R. 8844, Removing Barriers to Work for Disabled Americans Act, and H.R., we still don't know the number yet, the Continuing Appropriations Act of 2027. We'll talk about all this in just a moment. Last week in the Senate came back on Monday and voted to confirm the nomination of Arthur Roberts Jones to serve as a United States District Judge for the Southern District of Texas. On Tuesday, the Senate voted to confirm Matthew A. Schwartz to serve as a Circuit Judge for the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. Then the Senate voted to reject a motion to proceed to S. 4784, the Senate version of the National Defense Authorization Act. On Wednesday, the Senate voted to end debate on and then to confirm the nomination of Jeffrey T. Kuntz to serve as a United States District Judge for the Southern District of Florida. On Thursday, the Senate voted to end debate on the nomination of Marie Westerkamp to serve as a judge of the U.S. Court of International Trade. Then the Senate rejected a motion to proceed to S.J. Res. 198, a Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval of the rule submitted by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services relating to Medicare program implementation of prior authorization for select services for the wasteful and inappropriate services reduction model, that is the WISER model. And then they were done. This week in the Senate will come back today with the first vote set for 5:30 p.m. At that time, the Senate will proceed to a roll call vote to end debate on the nomination of Benjamin M. Flowers to serve as a United States Circuit Judge for the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Then I anticipate we'll see action on the National Defense Authorization Act, and we may see a vote to confirm Jay Clayton to serve as Director of National Intelligence. Now let's go back for a moment and talk about that House floor agenda. Speaker Johnson wants to send his members home to campaign for a 5-week August recess that begins on July 23rd. So he's got a lot of stuff to get done in the next 4 days. He's trying to move a bill that bans stock trading by members of Congress. He wants to move the annual defense policy bill. He wants to move a budget reconciliation bill. And he wants to move a continuing resolution to keep the government funded through December 4. Trying to move any one of those bills is a heavy lift, and success in moving any one of these bills would count as a good week's work done. And he's got 4 of them on his plate, and he wants them all done in 1 week, actually in 3 days, if you want to be accurate, because they won't begin the process by voting for a rule until Tuesday. Now let's talk about Adam Smith. Not the author of The Wealth of Nations. Now I'm talking about Democrat Congressman Adam Smith. He released a remarkable statement last Wednesday afternoon in the wake of his vote in support of the amendment offered by Republican Congressman Thomas Massie to the National Security State Department Appropriations Bill to zero out the $3.3 billion the U.S. government regularly grants in military aid to Israel. Here's part of what he said to explain why he voted against aid to Israel. Quote, "This was a very close vote for me. I am a supporter of Israel, and I recognize they are under profound existential threat. We should not forget October 7th, or the reality that Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran want to eliminate Israel. I also recognize that many of those who want the U.S. to completely abandon Israel do not support Israel's right to exist and are willfully blind to the dangerous, violent, extremist beliefs of Hamas and others who threaten Israel. I am deeply concerned about the tactics used by those on the far left to advocate for cutting off aid to Israel. To date, my family and I have had our home vandalized. A fire has been set in my driveway. My neighbors' lives have been disrupted by demonstrations in the middle of the night. Town halls meant to be forums for dialogue have been shut down, and a staff member has been physically assaulted. Those who engage in this type of behavior model a dangerous form of corrosive politics that seeks to intimidate those who disagree with them. We must be able to have civil discourse if we want to solve difficult problems, and I remain committed to open, respectful engagement." End quote. That's remarkable and troubling. Congressman Smith is saying publicly that his vote was influenced by physical intimidation, by coercion, not just threats of intimidation, but acts of intimidation. In other words, he caved to the hard left because they threatened him. And by putting out that statement, he acknowledged to the world that he caved to the hard left because of their intimidation. And by doing that, he essentially gave them and their tactics the thumbs up. It worked. He's just made himself and all his colleagues targets for future intimidation by the hard left. That does not bode well for us. Now to another Smith, Jack Smith. Jack Smith, the federal prosecutor appointed by Attorney General Merrick Garland to serve as special counsel to investigate President Trump, wrongfully viewed the text messages of more than 40 members of Congress. On Tuesday, the Department of Justice turned over records to Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley, showing that Smith's team had access to communications between Trump White House staff and 44 elected lawmakers. Targets from both parties included Senator Grassley, along with Republicans Susan Collins of Maine, Tom Cotton of Arkansas, along with Democrat Cory Booker of New Jersey, and former Congressman Lee Zeldin of New York and Karen Bass of California, and current Congressman Adam Smith of Washington, the one we were just talking about. For obvious reasons, there are separation of powers problems here. But Smith faces another problem. His testimony to Congress, asked during a December 2025 deposition, that is just 7 months ago, whether his team viewed, quote, the content of text messages, unquote, during his 2 probes into President Trump's actions, Smith answered no. Senator Grassley, who chairs the Judiciary Committee, said, quote, Smith's team ran roughshod over the Constitution even after repeated warnings. Jack Smith has answering to do, and I intend to have him before the Senate Judiciary Committee in the coming months to hold him accountable, unquote. Now let's talk about Reconciliation 3.0. Let's begin with the bill. It passed the Budget Committee last week on a party line vote of 20-14. Texas Republican Chip Roy, who had previously raised concerns about how the budget resolution did not find offsets for the spending it contained, and hence would simply add to the national debt, did not vote. He explained his non-vote in the committee as a function of his representational responsibilities. He had to leave Washington early to get back to his district, which was dealing with major flooding problems. The budget framework calls for $60 billion for defense funding, $13 billion for intelligence funding, $12 billion for agriculture to help farmers hurt by tariffs, and $10 billion for funding to incentivize states to adopt voter registration and voter ID requirements from the Save America Act. All told, that's a $95 billion price tag. The reconciliation measure does not contain the $350 billion defense spending request originally planned. House GOP leaders working with the White House came to the conclusion that asking for almost $500 billion in reconciliation funding would be too much of a stretch to do without including offsets to hold the votes of deficit hawks. So the $60 billion in defense funding that is included in the budget resolution is meant mostly to replenish stocks used up in the war with Iran. If the resolution passes, it will go to the Senate for consideration, and there it might or might not pass. Heck, in the Senate, it might or might not be brought to the floor. Senate Republicans from farm states may try to increase the amount of funding meant for farmers. They were on record saying they wanted $20 billion, not $12 billion. They could push for offsets to funding. They've got a new budget committee chairman in Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, who's been a deficit hawk since he first arrived in the Senate years ago. But offsets would likely make it possible for Democrats to offer all kinds of painful amendment votes. So that's up in the air. Stay tuned. Now to that continuing resolution I mentioned. A second major funding bill Speaker Johnson wants to pass is a continuing resolution that would keep the government funded at its current funding level through December 4. Yes, it's only July, and we would normally expect to see such a bill hit the House floor the last week of September, as the September 30 deadline approaches. That's one of those real deadlines that just can't be moved no matter how hard leaders try, because it's the deadline affiliated with annual government appropriations bills. The new fiscal year begins on October 1, and unless the Congress has passed and the President has signed, new appropriations bills to fund the government beyond September 30, we go into shutdown mode. So, why are we seeing a continuing resolution on the House floor in the middle of July instead of the traditional end of September? Because the Speaker has reason to believe that Democrats are likely to vote against a government funding resolution, even a clean one, meaning it has no extraneous policy riders attached to it that would be opposed by the minority party. It does not serve Democrats' political interests for government funding simply to sail through the House or the Senate. In fact, quite the opposite. It serves Democrats' political interests to foster chaos and shutdown. Why? Because everyone knows the Republicans run Washington. Republicans have the White House, and they are the majority in the Senate and in the House. So anything that goes wrong in Washington, including a government shutdown, must be the Republicans' fault, even if it's not. Just because Republicans run Washington does not mean Republicans control Washington. Even if every Republican voted yes on a government funding bill, whether it's a regular appropriations bill that provides funds for a few cabinet departments and related agencies, or a massive omnibus appropriations bill where they wrap all the government funding bills into one massive ball of wax, it still takes the votes of at least 7 Democrats in the Senate to move that bill. Why? Because it requires 60 votes to overcome a filibuster on the motion to proceed. And it requires the same 60 votes to overcome a filibuster on the motion to invoke cloture, that is, to end debate on the bill so they can vote. If you were to ask the average American which political party controls Washington right now, I'd be willing to bet a lot of money that most would answer Republicans control Washington. But that would not be right. Even with their majorities in both houses and their ownership of the White House, they do not control Washington. They certainly have more influence than Democrats, but they don't control Washington. But because that's what most people think, Democrats can use that to their political advantage in the lead-up to the November elections. If Republicans control Washington, then anytime there's chaos in Washington, it'll get blamed on Republicans. So it behooves the Democrats to cause chaos wherever they can, like on government funding. We fund the government every year using appropriations bills. These are regular bills, House resolutions or Senate resolutions designated by the abbreviation HR before the bill. Like all bills in the Senate, they must navigate a motion to proceed and a motion to invoke cloture or end debate before they get to their final passage vote. Each of those measures can be filibustered, meaning each of those measures must be able to win 60 votes before the bill can move to the next stage. So government funding can be held hostage by a minority, as long as the minority has at least 40 members. Do you know when was the last time there were 60 Republicans in the United States Senate? It was more than 100 years ago, in the 60th and 61st Congresses. That's 1907 to 1911, when Republicans had 61 and then 60 members of the Senate, respectively. In other words, in the era of the filibuster, which wasn't even introduced until 1917, Republicans have never, ever had enough seats in the Senate to be able to move a resolution past a motion to proceed without votes from the minority party. So, back to the continuing resolution, the catch-all government funding bill Speaker Johnson wants to bring to the floor this week. I expect he's doing that in the hopes that it'll pass the House and he'll be done with it. That may or may not happen. I suspect it will happen because the vast majority of the House Republican Conference has been with the Speaker on simple government funding issues, and this is no different. So let's assume it passes the House. Then it goes to the Senate. In the Senate, it's got to get past a potential filibuster on a motion to proceed. And then if it does, it has to get past a motion to invoke cloture or end debate before a vote on final passage. And that's where the Democrats can stop it, at either one of those junctures. Now, this can be complicated and it's confusing. Even the Vice President of the United States can be confused by it. Appearing last week on Joe Rogan's podcast, Vice President J.D. Vance said the following, quote, "The filibuster basically says anything that has to do with budget is 50 votes. Everything else, non-budgetary, is 60 votes. There is no provision in the Constitution. Senators are so attached to the idea that budget is 50, non-budget is 60, they're quite literally willing to prevent voter ID in America." End quote. He's confusing budget with budget reconciliation. It is accurate to say that there is no provision regarding the filibuster in the Constitution. But it is not accurate to say, quote, "The filibuster basically says anything that has to do with budget is 50 votes, end quote." An appropriations bill, that is, a spending bill, is clearly budgetary. It has to run the gauntlet in the Senate just like any other regular bill. It is subject to filibuster with a 60-vote threshold. So the vice president is confused about that issue. That's why Speaker Johnson wants to bring a continuing resolution to the floor this week. He wants to pass it and get it over to the Senate so that the Senate can vote on it before the Senate leaves town for the August recess. He wants to force a floor vote that he believes will show the Democrats willing to shut down the government again. And he wants that vote as soon as possible so his members can use that on the campaign trail during the August recess, if possible. Now, some people are suggesting he use the opportunity to attach the Save America Act to this CR. So Democrats opposing it would allow Republicans to claim on the campaign trail the Democrats voted against proof of citizenship to register and voter ID to vote, both of which are exceedingly popular. That was not the plan as of the weekend, but we'll see if the leadership makes any changes to the bill or possibly makes an amendment in order during the Rules Committee's consideration of the bill later today. Now let's talk about the Trump speech. On Thursday evening, President Trump made a speech to the nation from the White House, something he rarely does. For what it's worth, he did not use the traditional protocol of addressing the nation from behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office. Instead, he spoke to an audience in the East Room of the White House. In his 36-minute remarks, he accused the Chinese Communist Party of trying to help Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential election and claimed that some elements of the American intelligence community were aware of it, but covered it up and refused to inform Trump, the sitting president, of China's actions. He said that despite the fact that dozens of CIA and NSA reports circulated through the intelligence community documenting China's election meddling, those reports were not shared with him during his regular president's daily brief. That's big news. Now, on the miscellaneous front, on Monday of last week, U.S. District Judge Kathleen Williams, she's the judge overseeing President Trump's $10 billion lawsuit against the Internal Revenue Service over his leaked tax returns, she said in a scathing ruling that the lawsuit was filed for what she called improper purpose, and she referred one of his lawyers for potential disciplinary action. She accused Trump and his lawyers of, quote, having manipulated the court system when he sued a federal agency under his control, bypassing a requirement that parties in a lawsuit must have adverse interests, unquote. According to the Associated Press, Republican Congressman Randy Fine of Florida has informed White House officials that he intends to vote against every rule that comes to the House floor until President Trump gets rid of political advisor Alex Bruesewitz from his team. Fine's beef with Bruesewitz stems from a recent appearance Bruesewitz made on Tucker Carlson's podcast, where he called Fine, and I quote, that creepy fat guy from Florida who endorsed genocide, unquote, referring to Fine's support for Israel. Fine put his money where his mouth is. He was the only Republican to vote against the rule governing floor consideration of several bills last week. We'll see what he does this week and in weeks going forward. And that's our Washington Report for this week. If you've got any questions or comments, please drop us a line at jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. That's jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. If you want me to answer a question during the broadcast, just put "for broadcast" in the subject line. We'll be back next week with another edition of the Washington Report. Same time, same channel. Until then, be well and be active.